You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson. Glad to have you with us here this week where we're going old school. I'm going back into a discussion on politics. I still like doing this every so often. And when I discuss politics on here, Tho Bishop is one of my favorite people to get on because he knows a lot about a lot. And so he's steeped in these politics. He's the head of the Bay County Republican Party down in Florida, which is where I got to see him last week. Julie and Amy Mastrini and myself were down in Florida at what was the most amazing beach I've ever seen in my life. It was one of the beaches on 30A, the little strip of beaches down in Florida. If you've never heard of that, just Google image 30A beaches, and it was insane. It was brilliant. And I should quit telling everyone because they call it like Florida's best little secret, best kept little secret. And here I am telling the world, but y'all are my listeners, so you deserve to go too. You will not regret it, I'll say that. And while I was there, like I said, I had lunch with Tho. We start talking politics, and I said, can I get you on the show so we can go over this? Is Trump actually going to go to jail or prison? Is he really in trouble? What are these indictments all about? What's going on in the White House? What's up with DeSantis? Does he have a shot at all? And what about on the other side of the aisle? For once, there's a Democrat who's halfway interesting, and that would be RFK. We're going to talk about all of these things. Tho recently wrote a piece called Trump Indicted for Crimes Against Democracy. Ooh, how dare you do that? So let's get into it. Tho Bishop is the communications director for the Mises Institute. He is my friend. He is a Florida man, and here he is. Tho Bishop, welcome back to the show, friend. How are you?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. I don't always do as many episodes on politics as I used to, but I still like to get these in. And I've kind of stepped back because, as you know, there's so much every day. Look what's happening to this person, and this candidate said this, and back and forth. And it seems like maybe if I can take more of a macro view, and then when stuff really starts to hit the fan, find my friends like yourself who have a lot of insight and thoughtful analysis on these type of topics, and I'll bring you on. You've been on before. Most people that listen to this show should know who you are, but I also have kind of a wide variety of new listeners now. So having said all of that, give them an intro, whatever you find pertinent, and then we'll get into these fun political topics.
Yes, I'm content manager for the Mises Institute. Do a lot of things over there. We just had our Mises University summer program, which is always the best week of the year. A lot of great people there. Some great students this year, which is always fun to see. Just always neat to kind of see, having a little environment where people can be, young, curious, intellectual, having all sorts of interesting discussions, and sometimes not so interesting discussions, but having a really, really, good opportunity for people to be able to enjoy that. And then here in Bay County, I'm the chairman of our local Republican Party, which is fun for the most part these days. And so navigating that a little bit. But those are the two hats I wear right now.
I don't always like doing this, but I know your political background and the stuff you do. Do you have a label that you would give yourself politically?
I wrestle with that. It kind of depends.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the audience. What am I trying to communicate? There's some areas where, I'm not afraid of the libertarian label. I think the folk libertarian, anti-state, recognizing the regime for what it is. There's some value in that, but I don't want to be associated with a lot of other libertarians out there.
Right.
Paleo-libertarian, kind of within online circles. I think that's the literature I like the most. Florida man, has a certain spirit to it, but that kind of depends on. And I'm not even afraid of the conservative term increasingly. Sure. Particularly with the cultural side of things. So it kind of depends on the audience, but yeah, it's kind of difficult to. I'm a lot less hung up on labels than I perhaps once was.
Yeah, same. And so I mentioned I don't always follow the everyday politics, but it does seem that there's a lot of craziness going on at the moment. And even you've heard me say this, and our friend Mark Claire says this, that you can learn a lot from politics by watching WWE and professional wrestling. There's a lot of kayfabe. I think some of my audience should be familiar with that. But it does seem like, as much as skeptical as I get on the realness of politics, it does seem like this stuff with Trump, initially I was like, oh, give me a break. And then it does seem like there's some stuff, I'm not saying going on, meaning like he's a guilty party, but they seem to be really going after him. It seems more than just kayfabe at this point. Maybe I'm sound blue-pilled on that, I don't know. But you did write a piece called Trump Indicted for Crimes Against Democracy over there at Mises.org. So what the heck is going on with this stuff?
Yeah, I think Trump broke the sort of kayfabe nature of politics in a way that is really relevant, because it's easy to look at kind of what is going on with Trump, the indictments, and kind of the political backlash. And there's a narrative out there, and it's not an unreasonable narrative, right? That, oh, well, what's really going on here is that Democrat political operatives are trying to repeat the 2016 strategy that they had, and which didn't work, but kind of worked perhaps better in 2022 with the midterms there. The candidate they want to run against is Donald Trump. They know that indictments are the best thing that's happened to Donald Trump's campaign, right? Nothing crushed Ron DeSantis' polling quite like the raids at Mar-a-Lago and legal action started to be taken against the former president. And therefore, this is all sort of a cynical abuse of power, but that's what the feds are good at, to try to steer the Republican ship and kind of keep it firmly within the Trump camp. And while I think some of this is true, right, I think that there are definitely political operatives on the Democrat side that sees this as an electoral gain. I think the better understanding, and I think this taps into something that's much more interesting and broader, because it goes beyond Trump in an important way, is that Trump broke the kind of the code of DC politicians and really the state itself, right? If you read Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State, the core understanding there is the extent to which the state, no matter what size, no matter its form, no matter what it seeks to do, no matter what its ideology is, ultimately for any state to truly have power, to be confident within itself, it needs the perception of legitimacy. And that perception can come from the divine right. It can come from democratic approval. It can come from just respect for the institution of monarchy, whatever. But ultimately, there needs to be some sort of agreement by the majority of the population that the people in power have some sort of legitimate claim to that power. Because once you break that perception of legitimacy, that's where you have the fires of revolution, which can be a bad thing. Right. Even in the face of a really bad government, right? That's what's sparked this entire thing. And I think that there was an element where Trump's 2016 campaign, right, the vulgarity offended a variety of people, including a lot of conservatives. That was very much outside of the norms of Washington. But it was the way that Trump left, right? Because he governed for the most part, outside of maybe a decision here and there. He might have withheld some military action that a lot of people wanted him to do in certain places, and had no problem, calling airstrikes against Iranian officials. In other cases, right, a lot of his policies, his biggest policy achievement was like a Paul Ryan-driven tax plan. Most of his appointments, particularly in the early days, pretty run-of-the-mill mainstream sort of folks, right? He governed very differently than his 2016 message. And it could have been much worse. I think what Trump really wanted was to be that deal maker, right? He would have been perfectly happy with having Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer behind him smiling while he signed some sort of bipartisan legislation that would have been absolutely awful, and it could have completely sidelined, kind of the remnant of the Tea Party and that sort of stuff. The Democrats didn't take to that, and I think the vulgarity of Trump kind of was a part of that. And the way he left by saying these elections are rigged against me, the entire machine is corrupt, I should have won, yada, yada, yada. Now, the individual claims, and so the indictment, right, the core of the indictment against him by special counsel Jack Smith is that, Trump was told by members of his own campaign team, by various legal analysts, by various government officials that, there wasn't enough voter fraud to change the election, which might be true. he was told that, oh, well, Mike Pence can't return the delegations of certain states back to the state legislators, which would have created a very interesting legal dynamic there. There's all sorts of, you look back at the history of American elections, and particularly the 1876 election of Sam Tilden, or stolen election from Sam Tilden with Rutherford Hayes. There's all sorts of very interesting sort of history there. Regardless of all of this, anybody that was following what was going on there knows that the way the 2020 elections ran were unconventional.
Right.
Variety of states changed their, so even if there was no Kraken,
Right.
even if Dominion voting machines weren't running their data through Venezuela or China and manipulating the actual vote totals, right? It's clear there was something not right.
Right.
And when we think about it, we have a certain level of standard for evidence within a police investigation, because ultimately the integrity of that justifies the use of force by the police in theory, right? That lack of credibility, that lack of integrity in terms of handling ballots, right, went completely out the window, and all these sort of things. And so calling that out, so the legal argument, right, is that, oh, well, Trump was saying things he knew was not to be true, which is, I think, a difficult thing to prove, because you don't have anything saying, I don't think there's any quotes of Trump saying, I really lost, I'm just doing this for the grift, right?
Right.
They have that.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to make the argument that, oh, well, everything he was being told that he was saying was wrong, even though there's plenty of stuff here that I think Trump believed, and more importantly, the base believed.
Right.
And so they're blaming him ultimately, right, for January 6th, but really it's about, and which we can, that's a whole aspect with Fed escalation there. But ultimately, his real crime against the regime is making, if you think about it, I think still to this day, well over a majority of Republican voters believe the 2020 election was stolen. At the time afterwards, and I haven't seen polling since then, at least 2/3 of Trump voters thought the election was stolen. That comes to about 55 million Americans. How many more or less think that now? Whatever. But that's a large percentage of 50 million people is a lot of people. And he made them completely doubt the entire legitimacy of the entire regime. And ultimately, that is, I think, an unforgivable offense in the eyes of Washington. And I think that is why you see this true derangement syndrome. And what's interesting is that, while, whether or not he, the handling of classified documents should be a crime, whether or not other politicians have done the very same thing that Trump is accused of when it comes to like, oh, look at this map of military plans to invade Iran. I shouldn't be showing you this, but I'm showing you this.
Right.
Right. Regardless of that whole, the whatever you think about that, I can understand, there's probably viable legal arguments to say, hey, okay, this is probably a crime as it exists in the books that normally isn't held upon politicians, but whatever, it's Trump. This latest indictment, they're literally using legislation from 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Act, to say that, oh, Trump is an affront against the civil rights of Americans because he questioned the legitimacy of the election. And this is something that it's also worth pointing out. This is not a uniquely American issue right now. Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, he has been banned from running elections from, I believe, 8 to 10 years. I can't remember off the top of my head, but at least 8. The same exact thing played out there. His supporters last year stormed government buildings because they viewed those elections as being irregular. They even had a Brazilian form of the QAnon shaman. The parallels were just too uncanny. Yeah. And so Bolsonaro was deplatformed politically as a result of, again, this questioning the narrative, which again was more from the base than him in that situation. They're doing the same thing for Trump. And so what we see, I think, is this larger, with the breakdown of trust globally, remnants from COVID, remnants from a variety of different actions, the heavy-handed tactics economically, the Davos Great Reset stuff, is that the Western regimes are doubling down on taking out political opponents under the guise of fortifying democracy. And of course, the Biden administration was the first one out there saying the Brazilian elections were secure and stable and that sort of stuff. They are having to double down. And I think what's important from our perspective as people who are enemies of the regime, who see the evil of the ideology guiding the levels of power within the West right now, is that this is not the actions of a strong regime.
Right.
It is an actions of a dangerous regime, but it's a dangerous regime precisely because it is scared. it's a dangerous regime because it is weak. And I think that's what makes the campaign stuff, all of the Twitter discourse. I mean, it's all become a joke. I mean, it's all very depressing and exhausting. But I think this is something that's very interesting, and it's the only sort of, this is where Trump still provides value as a sort of icon of revenge, the icon of we don't, the referendum on the regime itself, and this indictment only further fuels those fires.
It's like if someone's choking you out or something, right? As you're starting to barely gasp for your last few breaths, and you just start swinging as wild as you can and maybe hope to knock this dude out. It does have a feeling like that's the regime at this point. I don't know that it's Trump doing that to them or Truth doing that to them. I don't know who's doing the choking out, but it does seem like they're swinging at the fences basically and just trying to figure out what's going on here. And it's like this last opportunity or attempt to like silence dissent as much as they can, but the toothpaste might be out of the tube at this point. I don't know. It seems like I can't imagine a future, and we're going to get into this too, I want to ask you about it, where Donald Trump is imprisoned and with his supporters remaining calm. And then I can't imagine a future where he wins the presidency and the establishment Democrat left, whatever you want to call the voters, they remain calm. This seems like it's going to come to a head at some point.
You're absolutely right. And I think that there was some sort of delusional belief within certain elements of Washington, and particularly on the Republican side, right? They thought that, okay, well, the Trump thing's exhausted people. Well, what people really desire, and I think this is probably true, what people desire more than anything else when it comes to politics is normality. They want something that feels stable. And they're willing to put up with all sorts of things that they'll complain about, so long as there is a larger feeling of stability, normalcy, right? They don't want, most people don't want to be inundated with politics on a daily basis. They don't want to wake up in sort of a frothing rage over political things. They're happy to complain about it here and there, but that's something that I don't think is good for society generally, and I think it's what most people don't want. And so I think that there was some belief that, okay, well, once we finally got over this fever, right, peace and calm would break out. But we're not seeing that. I mean, even if you look at within the Republican primary right now, if you look at the non-Trump candidates, all of them are doing, this Trump and then everyone else.
Yeah.
But the two most, the two closest to Trump right now is Ron DeSantis, whose entire campaign is basically, well, I'm Trump without the baggage. I've ruled Florida like a king. I've bullied my enemies. I've gotten my ways. I've taken major cultural wins. Right. Now, he doesn't have the charisma of Trump. The dynamic of Trump in the room is really hurting it. The more the regime cracks down on Trump, it hurts DeSantis. But like, he's not running as, no matter how hard the Trump camp might try to portray him, right? He's not running on sort of a Romney reset, right? The Republican Party. And then the other guy who is overperforming, I think, relative to all reasonable expectations, is Vivek.
Yes,
Ramaswamy. And Vivek, again, I think it's fair to question his sincerity on certain things. Like, I like Vivek. I think he's a bright guy. I think he's an ideas guy. He's right now he's raising his fist, saying, "Well, how dare they, call January 6th an insurrection?" A week after January 6th, some of his rhetoric there a little bit different in tone. Fine, whatever. It is what it is. Sometimes that's how life goes. But his narrative, his message, is more America first in some ways than Donald Trump is, right? So the top three candidates, which I think at this point make up 80% of the electorate, are all people who are leaning into the Trump message. The two trying to portray Trump without Trump, or Trumpism without Trump, and the rest are completely side stories, right? Even someone like Tim Scott, who would ordinarily be like a Republican dream, right? He's a black guy, which Republicans always, nothing irritates Republicans more than being called racist. Like, great, he's not very. I don't consider Tim Scott to be a very bright man, right? But he's a very aspirational man with the way he talks. He's a very positive message, right? Some of that Reagan style, Golden City on the Hill. He's got some of that to his rhetorical game. He raises a lot of money because he's a senator. I have a feeling he's probably going to end up replacing Mitch McConnell whenever he finally croaks. And so even someone like Tim Scott, right, is not being able to usher in sort of a reset to the politics of old. And again, that's what makes, I think, this entire dynamic, where the idea that you can have a political body with people that see Jack Smith as Captain America, righting the wrongs, finally holding bad guys accountable, prosecuting that racist, bigoted Donald Trump with Ku Klux Klan legislation, right? That's like a New York Times erotica.
Yep. Yeah.
Is what Jack Smith is doing right now, right? And the other side, you have people that view Jack Smith as Agent Smith from The Matrix, who is this enforcer trying to take down the good guy and to maintain this illusion of a world that we live in. There is no middle ground there, right? There is no, there can't be any political coexistence for compromise, for any sort of return to that normality. And these tensions, I don't think are going to go away. And even you talked about what happens if Trump does win, and I think there's some dynamics to it. But I think another way of looking at modern politics is that what Trump did is he elevated to the table the deplorables, right? People had disagreement in politics. They probably like Trump because he's entertaining. He's that vulgarity kind of was a reason why they were interested in him. He saw everyone as a bunch of crooks and losers, and he has that sort of aspirational golden palace, the macho nature, right? It goes to a UFC crowd and it goes crazy. So he elevated a certain sort of people to the table that had no real political voice. The Democrats in return, they elevated their crazies.
Yes, that's
right.
right.
They unleashed their moms, right? So they unleashed Black Lives Matter and Antifa and like their activist class onto the streets as their sort of shock brigade. And of course, the rules of the game don't apply evenly both ways, right? The deplorables are going to get cracked down by the regime because they are working against the regime. The crazies on the left that are working in favor of the regime are going to get treated with kid gloves and probably likely ending up with college jobs
and
bailed
in 20
out. Years.
Right.
But like that's another aspect here is that you have these sort of two armies that have been re-energized within politics that both sides are using against each other as well. And again, I think this is what makes this particular political moment, in spite of all the stupidity, a unique one and something that is going to end up shaping whatever comes next, however that might look like.
Are any of these, I don't always like to ask my guests to make predictions, but do any of these things against Trump right now, do they have sticking power to where he actually could be in legitimate trouble at some point, do you think?
I think ultimately Trump's legal outcome is dictated by who wins the election. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Trump. Like let's imagine a scenario where, like, say, Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis is able to somehow overcome Donald Trump in the primary. Then Trump gets pardoned, right? But ultimately, whether Trump, lives out his days in Mar-a-Lago, or I think serves jail time, comes down to who wins the 2024 election. I think, particularly when you look at, this is one of the broken aspects of the judicial process right now, is that when we have these highly politicized crimes, these highly politicized indictments and criminal charges, the left, the regime, can sort of cherry pick their jurisdictions. And so if you look at the way the DC, for example, votes in elections, right? It's like 95-5 team blue versus team red. How can Trump be considered by a jury of his peers?
Right.
If the majority of that jury pool are rabid anti-Trumpers, right? This, I think, played off with the ridiculous indictment. It was a civil charge with the woman that accused Trump of rape, and they found her no evidence of that, but still, had a civil penalty for sexual harassment or something like that, right? But it was in New York, and guess what? Trump could be, charged for anything in New York, and they're going to get convicted because New York hates Trump.
Yeah.
So this ability to cherry pick jurisdictions, which of course would not work for any other, sort of demographic style, right? The idea of civil rights protections that there's some sort of level that if the legal system as we have right now is built. Obviously there's been some gains with the recent Supreme Court cases, right? But effectively, American law right now is meant to have mechanisms that rein in bias and discrimination. But only if it's bias and discrimination on certain groups, right? So race, sexual orientation, gender identification, and most of the country, things like that. There's nothing that takes into account politics. And until there are civil rights protections for politics, if Trump has to be only, considered by, an equal partisan jury, for example, right? Then you're going to see this ability to cherry pick jurisdictions with these political charges, whether it's Trump, whether it's Trumpers, whatever. That is, I think, a dynamic where, again, this hyper this complete breakdown of political norms, questions a variety of institutions in this country that even if they wanted, even if you had good faith actors in theory, if you had angels running it, the way that the nation is right now, these institutions are not built for this level of political divide.
Mm-hmm. A lot of you guys are concerned these days about finding a safe place to live in this world as things get crazier and crazier. I'm about to tell you about a free online summit you can go to. He's going to tell you about legally eliminating your tax bills so you're not funding war, for instance, especially a war that's, well, closing down our actual church, which is horrific. He's going to tell you about international wealth protection, second passports. I think this sounds cool. Offshore banking, also intriguing. And the largest offshore event in the world. You can get a free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. And this is going to be put on by Mikhail Thorov, host of the Expat Money Show podcast. And again, this is a free online event at expatmoneysummit.com. Confirmed speakers will include one of my personal heroes, the great Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Mark Faber, Jim Rogers, plus international lawyers, offshore precious metals dealers, foreign real estate experts, and much, much more. Once again, it's free. Why not do this? expatmoneysummit.com is the website, and you can, provide some safety for your financial and living future. Let's get back to the show. So just to reiterate what you were saying, is the possibility of Trump, if he were to actually get in trouble, going to jail and or prison prior to that elections, that's not like the timeline's too short?
They'll probably kick that can down the road.
Okay.
The legal process works slowly. There'll be plenty of appeals, yada, yada. So I don't think Trump will actually be campaigning from a jail cell. I mean, that would be entertaining.
Yeah, can you?
I could see a pull. He can. He can run from behind bars.
That is crazy. Okay.
They're usually gadfly candidates, at least at the presidential level. I think there's a variety of Louisiana politicians that have won re-election but from behind bars. So he can be on the ballot even if he is a convicted felon. Now, there's, there are some dynamics there to, how the Republican Party could treat that. And that could create, but I think that would be if the Republican Party tried to kick Trump off the ballot because of federal prosecution and the Republican Party is dead.
They're done.
So in theory, there's some partisan tools that could be used there. But for the most part, even if Trump was convicted prior to the 2024 election, he would still be on the ballot, assuming he wins the Republican primary. The question is, what happens when that referendum of do you want this or not? The political outcome, I think, is going to end up dictating how far this stuff actually proceeds. And so I think ultimately the issue that Trump has is that, he's an extremely unpopular figure. And so the question is, how do you take this moment? What is 2024 about? Is it a referendum on Trump? Or is it a referendum on the regime? And if it's a referendum on the regime, then I think that creates an environment where Trump can win.
Yes.
If it is about a referendum on Trump, I think Trump loses. And so how Trump's campaign, again, assuming it's the nomination, is able to create that distinction. Obviously, with every major institution against him, they're going to try to craft that other narrative. That, I think, ultimately is going to be the story of the 2024 campaign, and the results of that are going to have far-ranging ramifications in a variety of ways.
Well, I have one way he could do it. And, we hear from the establishment, I can reach across party lines. That's always been their shtick. And usually when that happens at the federal level, it's not good. But RFK Jr. is certainly an interesting prospect. And although he is a Democrat, he's certainly not a 2023 Democrat, let's say. And yes, for the people listening, yes, I understand there's things I wouldn't like about certain aspects of his platform, but you have to admit he's been the best on the worst elements we've seen in the last 3 years, things I've keep getting strikes and flags for, so I'm not going to talk about him in depth. But what are your thoughts on RFK? And I have heard rumors that it would be possible for Trump just to tap him as VP candidate, but that is a dangerous ticket. We saw what happened to his relatives, and we know that that's what they'd like to happen to Trump. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm someone who was never, a RFK Jr. guy. Now, recently had a daughter, so my interest in childhood vaccination schedules has certainly skyrocketed in recent last few months. And then I listened to him. So I kind of thought, okay, well, this is interesting, right? I like interesting political stories. And then I listened to him on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I was like, this is great. And now I'm not here to talk about the validity of every claim he made. I've talked to people who are far more knowledgeable about me about certain topics. It's like, he's wrong about this Mercury stuff here. Okay, fine. I'm not here to tell you that 5G is going to kill your immune system. Nor am I here to tell you it's not.
Correct. Yeah.
But watching that interview, it was particularly as someone who likes who has great respect for Ron DeSantis. It was in one part very just fascinating to see someone have just a 3 hour long conversation on such a variety of topics, off script. I mean, you just don't get that very often in politics. I mean, there's very few that could pull that off.
Yep.
And it was also frustrating. It's like, that's exactly what DeSantis should have been doing, right? Like he should have been leveraging his knowledge of these issues. I mean, he's not the most charismatic guy. I mean, neither is Kennedy, really. I mean, his voice isn't particularly great. I mean, he has his Kennedy looks, but he's not, it's not his uncle. And that's what I was sold. And what was interesting is I asked some friends of mine who are not particularly political, right? They watch a lot more UFC than and on an average Saturday than they'll watch cable news their entire year. And they were talking about it. And I think that ultimately, if Trump's campaign is going to be genuinely interesting, he can have two paths, right? So, because the problem is if Trump's the nominee, just the bare political question is, how do you expand the appeal? How do you get non-Trump people to vote for Trump? And the classic campaign consultant is going to say, oh, well, we need to offset Trump with some focus group tested, minority woman, bland politician to try to get, people that like Liz Cheney to hold their nose and vote for Donald Trump because at least there's a grown-up in charge in the vice president spot.
Yeah, Nikki Haley of sorts.
Yeah. And I think Tim Scott could be in that role. I think Nikki Haley could be in that role. I think there's a variety of people who effectively are interchangeable that could fill that role. And that would be absolutely depressing. That'd show that Trump has learned absolutely nothing. Yep. That he's still trying to be liked by people that hate him.
Yes.
That would be a very unenthusiastic ticket, in my opinion. But you put in someone like RFK Jr. I think, as you mentioned, plenty of issues where he's wrong. I don't trust him on guns. I don't trust him in the environment. I don't trust him on a variety of things, right? But I do think that he really wants to, break up big pharma. I think he really understands the evils perpetrated by the FDA. I think he would absolutely throw Fauci and Gitmo if he had the ability to do so, right? These are all things I would like to see. And so you put, so a ticket of that I think can win over that Joe Rogan viewer. I think shifts the entire narrative away from being a referendum on Trump and how much Trump are you willing to put up with in order to, have Team Red back in the office and think about all the great legislation that, Mitch McConnell, if he's still alive, can push to the Senate, right? It's going to be those tax cuts, baby. No, on the other side, if you put Kennedy on the ticket, then it steers that conversation closer to that referendum on the regime itself. Yeah, Kennedy has his own attacks. Trump has his own attacks. It would bring in, I think that would make a more meaningful broadening of that base. And again, if you told me 6 months ago that the only way that I'd get excited about a Republican ticket is to put RFK Jr. on the other side, I'd say that you're crazy. But in a world where Donald Trump became president, everything's crazy. Yeah. The other thing is that there's a beautiful aesthetic touch to it. This kind of Elon Musk's idea that the most probable outcome is the most amusing one. If you remember back, one of the hallmarks of the QAnon mythos, right, is that JFK Jr. was going to reveal himself to still be with us and maybe even replace Pence on the ticket. And he might have been Q the entire time. And he's going to be, he's one of the white knights out there that's really, that Trump really relies upon. Of course, did not happen. What better replacement for John F. Kennedy Jr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Yeah, I mean, it's too perfect. So, and I also think for Trump, who cares so much about the aesthetics, again, there's no blue collar brand that you can associate yourself in American politics than that Kennedy brand. So I think it works from a variety of different angles. I like that Trump still has a few crazy people around him, like Roger Stone. I mean that with a great deal of affection. Yes, because I think Roger Stone recognizes this angle. Roger Stone does not think like a typical DC consultant. And so if Trump was actually to make that one move, to me, it would be not just important for electoral outcomes, but it would be a reflection that Trump is actually willing to act on improving the areas where he was most wrong the first time around. And all of a sudden, again, I'm not expecting Trump to usher in some sort of grand revival of the Republic, but in terms of making very bad people pay.
That's right.
That increases the likelihood of that happening should he succeed in 2024. And that is also important because no matter the craziness of the election itself, it's what's come after that matters. And, Trump has given a lot of reason for skepticism about his ability to wield power effectively. And one thing he can decide is who is his VP. That move would be a very promising step in the right direction.
Did you happen to see RFK on with Hannity?
I'm not.
Oh, Lord, have mercy.
I try to limit my Hannity time as much as possible.
Jeez, he is
no matter who he's interviewing.
Yeah, that's rough. It's when I heard RFK with Dave Smith and then also with Joe Rogan, and it's wild to think of one of these people I know, and the other one is what the left considers some sort of meathead kind of MMA doofus. They are so much smarter and so much better at what they do than Sean Hannity. It was just, there was something along the lines of Hannity's trying to shoehorn in his opinion on Russia and Ukraine. And of course, RFK's got quite a very good opinion on that matter. And he says that, Russia tried to come to the table for peace agreements, but the U.S. and NATO pushed it away and said no. And Hannity goes, "Oh, so you trust Vladimir Putin? You like him?" That's just like, it reminded me of that lady that interviewed Jordan Peterson a long time ago. So what you're saying is, and it's like, dude, no. But speaking of people that used to work with Hannity that no longer do, I'm starting to feel like my prediction of Tucker running for the Republican nomination might not come to play this time. But did you happen to see his stuff with Tim Scott or with Mike Pence?
Yes.
Do you think Tucker at this point is a kingmaker?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
And in fact, this kind of goes to, I think, DeSantis' weakness is that, if you're thinking about how can you sell Trumpism without Trump, you can't do it, I don't think, without the support of Tucker Carlson. I think Tucker Carlson is the second most important political figure within conservative America.
I do too.
I don't think he's quite more powerful than Trump at this point, though I think he's someone who Trump desperately, again, that's the thing about Trump, is that Trump wants the affection of people that he respects, however that frame might be. And so I think Tucker is someone who can manipulate Trump in his views more than Trump is someone who can manipulate Tucker in his views. So who really has the higher hand there? It's a valid question. But I think that DeSantis, when he and the biggest mistake that DeSantis made is that rather than kind of embracing this sort of Caesarian figure where, he is someone who can give power to the base, the populares, while taking the money from the elites. He instead focused too much on trying to take money from the elites, thinking that he could buy the support of the people. It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
And so when he started dancing around like his opinion on Ukraine and Russia, which I trust DeSantis on Ukraine and Russia. I think that his view is, I think it's fine. And you had that back and forth with him at that Blaze event as well. I actually trust DeSantis a lot more than many in our circles on foreign policy. I think he'd be an effective ideological change agent within the State Department and the Pentagon. But by doing that, I think he made Tucker question his reliability. I think that Tucker would have been a DeSantis supporter if he maintained a consistent position on the issue that he cares about most. And so in Tucker, I think it was one of his first videos, he talked about, I think it was in the aftermath of one of the other Trump indictments, and he ended his dialogue saying the reason why Trump is being indicted is because of his questioning the war machine, and the only viable candidate we have that can stick it to the war machine is Donald Trump. That's when I realized DeSantis' campaign is in massive trouble, because that said that either Tucker sees DeSantis as part of the problem or doesn't see him as a viable candidate. And I'm not sure which is worse at that point. And so, Tucker's absolutely a kingmaker. The way that he was able to completely, Mike Pence will never be able to recover, and he's not helping himself either.
No.
And to be fair, I think Pence, I think I think Pence's point that he was trying to make at the Blaze event was that he doesn't consider an issue to be both aggressive militarily and take care of streets, right? Like I don't think you're saying cities aren't my I don't have attention on my streets. It doesn't matter though, because it's about what the soundbite is, and the soundbite was awful.
Yeah.
His pantsing of Asa Hutchinson was just wow. I mean, to the extent that Asa Hutchinson can ever be entertaining, he filled his role perfectly as the fool.
He did.
I wish he was a little harder on Nikki Haley, but I think he also helped reveal in a very careful manner of the lack of substance that Tim Scott had by really sorting, and of course Tim Scott was like, oh, you're such a smart guy, and Tucker's like, well, no, I'm not, not really. I'm just trying to ask you some questions here. Yeah. And so the more that Tucker is able to, particularly post Fox News, assert himself as that influence peddler, as that filter by which Republicans have to run through, is better off, because Tucker's someone who I don't agree with him on all the issues. I wish that he would understand what Austrian economics really is, rather than kind of use it as a code for Koch brothers. But he's someone who I think is, the fact that he has the power and influence he has right now is very good for the American political intellectual environment. And particularly his standing is so significant because what you have right now is like there isn't a must-see political pundit out there, right?
Right.
The days where you can go on Fox News all the time and the conservative base is just going to soak it up. I mean, Fox News' ratings have tumbled. There is no Rush Limbaugh. That was the biggest microphone in the conservative movement, right? Tucker is the only guy. I mean, Steve Bannon sort of has a niche within himself. It's his raw numbers aren't as large, but the people that follow him, or they really follow him. But Tucker's a very unique figure that people actually care to seek out his opinion on things. And given that there's so fewer of them than perhaps there have been in the past, makes his power even greater. And I think that's a very good thing.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, who's like that on the Democratic, on the left-wing sides, let's say? And it's just like, well, all of them. There's no one that's big. It's just the massive amount. And I thought it was so telling. I believe Don Lemon got fired either the day Tucker was let go or the next day. And he just went into oblivion. No one cared. No one spoke about him. He would never, ever get an offer from Elon Musk to come on. And not necessarily because of his politics, just because it'd be a waste. No one cares. And I that was so telling. And so speaking of that side of the equation, you and I spoke about this when we were in Florida last week. Both of us seem to think someone other than Joe Biden will be the nominee in 2024. Are you leaning, you're also a sports bettor, would you bet money that it's someone else besides Biden?
Depending on the odds, I wouldn't want it at even odds.
That's true. I'm asking a legit bettor here. Know.
But yeah, I mean, like, if you gave me 4-1 odds or something like that, I'd consider putting a little bit of money down. Just because ever since Valerie Jarrett left the Biden White House, the news reports against Biden have started to trickle, and for a variety of ways. Like Biden's very mean in meetings with staffers.
And who's Valerie Jarrett, just for my people listening that aren't?
So Valerie Jarrett was one of, she comes from Obama world. She was, I think it's domestic policy advisor, one of those shadow figures that Glenn Beck would put on his chalkboard, and sort of highlight. And I think she does have some legitimate, she comes from the Chicago style, political mafia model. She's also the reason why Roseanne Barr got kicked off of her show.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But she's someone who will knife anybody who gets in her way. And I think that Obama world proper, I think they're happy with power. I think that they've succeeded on getting a lot of their people in the Biden administration. I think they see Biden, as anybody with two eyes can, as an embarrassing, bumbling idiot with severe mental decline. And ever since that change with Valerie Jarrett within the administration, that's when you started hearing about whistleblowers on Biden family corruption. That's where you started. And the Biden family corruption stuff, I think it's obviously real. I think it's clear what was going on there. And when you combine a aging, decrepit fool, I mean, Joe Biden has never been smart, even at full mental capacity. and you combine it with corruption, when you combine it with the inability to thread certain needles more broadly with the coalition, you have people on the left that sees him as too moderate. You have people that, you have moderates that run away from him because the rank and file average Obama staffer is far to the left of where Obama was, even if Obama himself is far to the left of what I think Biden is when he can have a thought. And so I don't think anyone's happy with Joe Biden outside of anyone's drawing a paycheck from Joe Biden. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Biden is eventually forced to step down, a variety of reasons to do so. And so then that creates the interesting dynamic of who comes next. And historically, you'd expect to be Kamala Harris. I think everyone knows it's not going to be Kamala Harris because she's the least liked politician in the world. And then you have this very interesting turf battle between Obama world and Newsom world.
Yeah.
And I think that this, in many ways, is a continuation of the Clinton and Obama power dynamics. Because what many people may not remember is that Newsom has been critical of Obama in the past, and it really comes down to just pettiness. Obama, back when he was running in 2004 for the Senate, he would refuse to get photographed with Newsom publicly, even though Newsom was raising money for his senatorial campaign. Why was that? Well, it's because Gavin Newsom was the first mayor to legalize gay marriage, which, it's funny how times change. And so Obama didn't want to be associated with that because he thought it would hurt his black cred. And so Newsom never forgave the fact that Obama refused to get a picture taken with him. So Newsom in 2008 was a big Hillary proxy. There's obviously various other kingdoms of California politics that he brings into the table, but I think that the Hillary Clinton apparatus would love to see Gavin Newsom. And so the question is, who would Obama world choose as their champion? And the thing is that Obama was not very successful at getting heirs elected. I mean, he was a disaster for the DNC. He was a disaster for down ballot races. He was a disaster on a variety of things outside of his own electability. And so that kind of leaves a very small number of options. And I think the one that would be the most interesting would be Michelle Obama. Who has this sort of Oprah, I just want children to be healthy, sort of thing to her. Now, whether that holds up with the rigors of a campaign, particularly if she has a Newsom going against her, that's a different dynamic there. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if you end up seeing the Democrat race end up becoming a Newsom versus Michelle Obama battle, which would be very fascinating. Now, admittedly, the time frame for that is tricking down. Maybe this prediction, there's at some point, this is going to have to happen if it's going to happen. Maybe they do end up just running Biden again. I mean, that should be the expectation. The expectation should always be that the incumbent is going to run for re-election. But given that we're in such a weird and crazy time, it wouldn't surprise me at all if you ended up having that happen. If that happens, it's going to be a very, very fascinating showdown between California Hillary world versus Chicago Obama world, and I guess now Martha's Vineyard world. And that could be I think that would end up being a even dirtier campaign than what we saw with like Bernie Sanders versus Hillary, where Bernie seemed perfectly okay with being the lovable loser. And that one, I don't think neither Newsom nor Obama world would be happy, because in Michelle's case, she's basically running on Obama's legacy at that point. I think that would be a very fascinating showdown on the Democrat side.
Yeah, yes, it would. It's kind of scary to me if she were to win that, because I don't know, sound black-pilled on it, no pun intended, but she seems like she could win the presidency. But I do want to ask also, I have, and as I know you will, kind of a nuanced view on what Trump represented when he won, as he governed, the movement, the phenomenon, all of it. I personally think it had to happen, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. What did he represent as the victor up until 2020?
Well, what he represented was a transformation of the Republican base. And now, again, that's why he's still, one of the most influential endorsers in the Republican side of things, even in areas that you don't think as being prototypical Trump world. He transformed what Republican voters want fundamentally. I think largely in good ways. I think that his rhetoric on economic policy, particularly one of the fascinating things I think about Trump from an economic point of view is that his rhetoric on trade, in particular, was very protectionistic in rhetoric. Right, it was all about protecting American jobs and yet he governed. His actual governing style when it came to international trade was very fascinating because he used tariffs not as a means to protect American industry, but rather as a bargaining chip on the table to kind of renegotiate trade deals and kind of project American influence abroad. And that style, I think that's an important distinction, because I'm okay. I'm not offended at the idea that we should put tariffs on China. China's a bad actor. China doesn't like America. China's a geopolitical rival. They rip off our, any American business doing business in China is doing so out of greed and trying to get access to the Chinese market. They're not doing it because of cheap labor or anything like that. And so a tariff on China is very different than blocking American trade with Bangladesh, Thailand, right?
Yeah.
I think that would be a mistake. And so I think Trump's movement has opened up a lot of projection of, let's just call it free market ideas. Of course, most advocates of free markets do a good job in their own right of I think undermining the case for free markets, because often it kind of gets brought into this materialistic number goes up sort of thing, rather than a stable functioning society. And I think there's a wonderful moral foundation of free markets and the like. And so I think that the downside of Trump is some of those shifts in terms of opening up the door for, we can call it, national socialism, if you want, to a certain degree, right? Kind of a left, a culturally right, economically left point of view within the intellectual sphere. I don't think it's going to win out in the end, but it opened the door for that because of some of the rhetorical choices there. But more importantly, though, is that it shifted this relationship between the base and the feds. It made Richard Hanea, who's a very interesting political Twitter commentator, and nice thing about Richard Hanea is that half the takes are going to say, oh, that's interesting, and the other ones are saying this guy's crazy. One of his analysis, I think, of Trump in the 2024 campaign has been spot on, where he said that the reason why Republicans love Trump and aren't going to move on from Trump is that Trump makes them laugh. That more than a good good governance, what Republican voters want is Johnny Carson. Mm-hmm. And they and then I get that, right? The memes are great, right? Politics was a lot more entertaining. It's a lot less depressing,
right?
When you had Trump meme magic memes, and him having college football players, a whole bunch of McDonald's and the like, right? It was just more entertaining. It brought less depression in your life.
Wasn't it Rothbard that said that they'd make it boring on purpose?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
because they don't want the people engaged. They don't want the people to care. And so what you have now is that the way that the FBI, the Department of Justice, and all these bad actors are treating Donald Trump, they're not simply treating a political candidate. They're treating the most popular celebrity to right-wing America, right? This would be like treating Tom Cruise like this. It would be like treating Johnny Carson like this. And so what it means is that all these problems the FBI, we are all living under the shadow of corrupt prosecutors, right? Any one of us could be at the very least indicted for some trumped up charge anytime we got in the crosshairs of the FBI, if they so desired it. The inner corruption is not unique to Trump. This is something that's baked in the pie for a very long time. What Trump has done is that he has broadened the attention to it because it has happened to someone of his stature, someone who is so beloved, someone who is so respected by a large percentage of the country. And that foundation, that reckoning, I think is so important to getting people to really understand what DC truly is. And DC is not us. The American government does not represent us. It is an occupational regime on American soil. And I think breaking down any respect that one has for the authority of Washington, D.C. Is a net positive in terms of how we think about our relationship with the government, our responsibilities to citizens, our approach to things. And so that, I think the trumpeting and its continuing, again, and the beauty of this is that DC keeps fueling the best parts of Trump rather than capitalizing on the worst aspects of Trump, which was his desire to be that deal maker, bipartisan guy. Yeah. And that is, our enemies have done a lot of the work for us.
Yeah, it's almost, it's the things that those of us on the right have been warned about by people like Curtis Yarvin. The regime's kind of doing the same thing. Don't push back against your enemies. Don't push back. If the regime just said, they were nice to Trump and kind of spoke the right things into his ears, I think he could play right into their game. But they're kind of doing worse as is. Before I get you out of here, you are in Florida. I suppose there's some silver linings that if Trump beats DeSantis in this primary, you get to keep the best governor. How are things there?
Yeah. Things are great for the most part. I think the area where I'm most excited about DeSantis is the education side, not only for the K through 12 dynamic, most importantly, taking back higher education institutions as as something that can be profitable. I used to be like, just don't go to college sort of guy. I myself am a college dropout. But one of the things I think the last few years have demonstrated is the importance of having conservative lawyers, conservative doctors, right? Those sort of skills professions. And also as a college football fan, I don't want the University of Georgia to be surrendered to the left, so that I'd have to consider breaking ties with a family historical institution in that regard. So I want us to take back these institutions, particularly state-funded ones. And so I think that's the stuff that is the most exciting. There are some issues that DeSantis is having to deal with in the distraction of the campaign. In terms of affordability issues, particularly home insurance is a big issue here. There are some of those underlying. I mean, that's one of the interesting problems, that when you create a political environment that people want to flee to, that increased demand, which is not, it's not generated by population growth, but rather by political refugees. And it's the same sort of issue that you have with a national immigration, right? That you have that influx of people that is not natural per se. That creates a great demand on housing and affordability and things like that. And so those are very real issues. I don't have easy answers. Peter Thiel has talked about this, that if Florida really wants to become the blueprint, it needs to figure out a way of addressing the housing problems that is the same sort of situation that really undermined California's economy on top of all the other craziness. So that's the issue that Florida has in the short term. The longer term, the political trajectory, it will be interesting to see what comes next, because DeSantis was a unique figure within Florida politics. I mean, he's the most powerful governor in state history. Who picks up that mantle going forward? Do you get a reset to Rick Scott has he's challenged McConnell. I'm not trying to pick on Rick Scott. Plenty of things I disagree with him as governor. He could be a lot worse. But I don't want to see a return to the Rick Scott years as Florida governor. And so, who can take up that mantle of continuing this sort of very, very aggressive wielding of power to continue to make the free state of Florida that sort of leader nationally in terms of state governance. And so I'm interested to see, is someone like Matt Gaetz, who I think is the most impressive congressman in D.C., not only because he is this fascinating combination of intelligent and entertaining, which you need both. Someone who's just as comfortable talking about MK Ultra as he is dealing with constituency services. I mean, that's a remarkable talent. I'd be very interested to see if he runs. I think he would be a very powerful force. What I would love to see is the DeSantis's taking from the South America model, getting around constitutional term limits, and maybe have Casey DeSantis run to replace her husband in that position. I'd be perfectly okay with that. So what comes next? That's the constant dynamic when you have sort of great political men. When you have that consolidation of executive power used wisely, it's how is that power passed on, and so that is going to be a major challenge. But when I talk to what Florida Republicans want, I think they do not want to return to the old. And so whoever wins, whoever takes up that mantle going forward, they're going to have to sell themselves as the best heir of the legacy that Florida has established for itself politically. And I think that is something that's promising.
Well, the housing pricing going up because everyone's moving there, it could drop because CNN ran a story and they told me and everyone watching that people are moving out of Florida. They had a trans kid and the mom and dad just couldn't take the evil laws that DeSantis is promoting there in Florida. So they're leaving.
I hope they leave by larger numbers and faster. That'd be a wonderful thing.
I was picturing you watching this and going, bye.
I've got plenty of realtor friends here that would love to start an underground railroad to California for all of these abused trans children and their sick, twisted parents.
Yes, amen. What's going on with the Mises Institute? You guys got anything you'd like to plug? You're welcome to do so.
Yeah, no. Again, we had Mises U last week, which was great. We've got some great events coming up. We've got a great one in Nashville.
Yes.
In September, we're going to have a lot of very interesting figures talking about, the decrepit state of this regime of lies. Michael Rechtenwald, who's done a lot of great work on the Great Reset, is going to be speaking there. Ted Carpenter, who got fired from Cato for anti-war views on the Russia-Ukraine situation, he's going to be speaking. It's going to be a great lineup. And so we've got a lot of great stuff going forward from the event side of things. And so that's all great. We've got some great content. And so, we keep charging ahead.
And the podcast.
Yes, Radio Rothbard, which is our weekly podcast. Do it with Ryan McMakin, who is our executive editor at the website. We have a lot of fun. It's a weekly show. And the numbers keep going up. So that's one of the things we've learned is that there's the demand for podcasts and audio content. We see a major change from daily articles, which we're always very reliant upon, Facebook for massive views. We've got a lot. We have a very steady readership there, but we don't get those sort of viral articles now. But our podcast audience keeps growing and has been a great source of strength. So you guys keep listening. I'll keep having a job. So I encourage you guys to check it out.
Excellent. I will link to all that in the show notes page for this episode. Tho Bishop, thank you, sir. Good to chat with you again.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, sir. See, now you are all dialed in on what the heck is going on within the political world these days. And next week is going to be a very good one. Julie Mastrini is back on, this time to discuss what she knows better than anyone I know. That's the hint I'm going to give you. It has to do with what she does for a living. And the more I talk to her about this certain topic, the more my mind is blown on just how much she knows about it and how much I thought I knew about it and I did not. So it's going to be a good one. As far as special club, patreon.com/counterflow, $5 or more per month get you in this exclusive club where once a month you will be invited to our Zoom chats. They are not recorded. They are not published. We can be as open about anything we'd like to be, open and honest. And we always have a special guest. Last month, Father Turbo was our special guest, and that was a great one. I'm contacting the gentleman that I want to be the special guest this week, so I should get that lined up. And let's see. As for this show, counterflowpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter @BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And what else? Join the Telegram group. It's always going strong. And I guess that's about it. Until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in half, like on the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.